Hello, welcome to NCITE Presents. My name is Rik Legault. I am the Director of the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education, which is the Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence for Terrorism Prevention and Counterterrorism Research. I'm here today as part of the team presenting for you on behalf of Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology, Office of University Programs. So they fund our center to be able to translate research that's funded by the government to the people who need it most. And I'm really thrilled to have over 200 of you here today. The people who we are trying to speak to and share this research with are practitioners, they're policymakers, they're members of the media, they're other academics in this space. And I'm just thrilled to see how many of you took time out of your day to join us. What we're doing is a really timely topic, and it's timely for a lot of reasons, but specifically because we're trying to help the people who are assessing threats to prevent failure of imagination in what those threats might be. So to ground us in the importance of today's talk, I want to share a little bit of data from one of our closest partners, consortium partners at the Center for Naval Analysis. So Dr. Meg McBride is the principal investigator on a project that has worked with the START Center at University of Maryland to assess the backgrounds and histories of individuals who were perpetrators of mass casualty violence and terrorist attacks in the United States. Her research has found that 61.5% of these individuals were known to someone in the stakeholder community before the attack. So that might be law enforcement, it might be a licensed mental health provider, it might be that they were reported to their school principal. So 61% were known. So the issue is not about knowing who the threat actors are, it's being able to predict what they're going to do. And so this is why the Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology has funded a large study from NCITE to be able to assess just that. And really, it's to be able to help the people who are know who the perpetrators and threat actors are, to be able to predict where they're going to attack, what they're going to do, and to give them the most scientifically valid tools available to be able to do their jobs. So we wanted to share that research with you all here today. My job is really just to introduce the importance of the session and to keep it moving so we can be in and out within an hour. So what we've done is we've invited two NCITE researchers who have been working on this project that was funded by the Office of Science and Technology, Ajmal Aziz and Dr. Rik Legault, to be able to share some of their important findings with you. And then we also have the senior social and behavioral scientist, Dr. Rik Legault from the Office Science and Technology Directorate for Department of Homeland Security here presenting as well. So what they're going to do is each of them will share their findings and their assessment for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have questions from a show flow perspective, what you'll do is you will simply type it into the chat and we will be monitoring them as they come in and I will ask them on your behalf. I see we have a couple of NCITE board members and our program manager who are here listening. So I want to make sure we are highlighting their questions if they have them, but also any of you in the audience who are here listening. I'll ask those questions. We'll have a moderated discussion. And then at the end, we'll give each of our panelists about a minute to wrap up and tell you what sort of the big takeaway or bluff is for you as you leave for your day. At the end of this, what will happen is we'll post this recording online. We'll also post a short summary as we do all of our NCITE Present seminars for those of you to be able to look at it at your leisure or share it out with your colleagues. Everyone who registered will get this link. So to begin, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. His name is Dr. Sam Hunter. Sam is the senior scientist here at NCITE. He leads incredible work for us looking at sort of the empirical data that underlie some of the social and behavioral science tools that are most readily used and available for people to make decisions about how to keep our community safe. Sam's an industrial and organizational psychologist. He has a long career. I'm not going to read his whole CV, but I will tell you that he is the editor or editorial assistant on all of the major journals in his field. He's a fellow in our professional organization, and I would trust no one else to lead our threat assessment portfolio than Dr. Sam Hunter. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sam, to share what you have found.
Thanks, Gina. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited about getting a chance to share the work we've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years at this point. I want to reiterate thanks to Ajmal Aziz as well. He's been instrumental in allowing us to do the kind of science that I think is both necessary and quite impactful. So special thanks to him. What I thought I would do today is kind of give two broad talking points. The first is to share this large deliverable, or at least the sort of core findings of this large deliverable, 250 pages plus. It's, I think, in LinkedIn, not the chat, but the sort of the place that folks can take a look and see that link. Scott put that in there, so you can see that if you haven't already. And so I'll share those high level findings, and then I'll narrow the aperture a little bit to talk about really the focus of today, which is about protecting against novel and emerging threats, or those kinds of threats we might not be as readily able to identify. So to kind of start with the first point, to give a bit of background, about two and a half years ago, we were given the opportunity to get a lay of the land with regard to measurement around threat and risk assessment. There are a range of tools that exist, and DHS asked, give us an overview of the quality of those tools, as well as how well they work, and make some recommendations about them. One of the first things we did was we found the leading experts in this space. So we went out to University of College London and met with Paul Gill and his team, and were able to work with them. Amber Seward was a big part of that team, just presented at NCITE, did a great job. It was wonderful to hear some of the work that they've shared out. So I'll briefly summarize some of their findings, but encourage you to take a look at the report as well. So the findings were as follows. They looked at 1.3 million data points, over 2,000 studies, 23 meta-analyses, which are studies of studies, and ultimately found cautiously optimistic perspective with regard to risk and threat assessment tools. Certainly variability, but the takeaway was when viewed through a multivariate standpoint, these tools serve an important purpose. They're designed and developed by thoughtful scientists, have good construct and content validity, and serve a core function when it comes to risk and threat assessment. They're not perfect by any means, and as a standalone tool, without using any other components to the toolkit, are sort of on the lower moderate end with regard to utility, but where paired with a broader toolkit are a key part and component of that. And that was echoed and reiterated when we had a chance to talk to the folks who use these tools. And so the second part of the project really began once we were able to take Paul's team's findings and then go out and talk to folks that do this work. And if any of the folks are on the call today, let me tell you how inspired we were by getting a chance to listen to the work that you do. It was humbling. We would spend a lot of time after these calls really hammering home how important the work was because of the feedback that we received. And so we talked to folks from across the Homeland Security enterprise. This included folks inside DHS and DoD, the national labs. We ran the gamut of individuals. And we have a number of findings in the report that sort of highlight the key takeaways with regard to these interviews. But three really jumped out that are worth mentioning here. And the first was just how variable the use cases were with regard to these tools. This is both within and across tools. So in some ways, it's not surprising. A number of these tools are developed for different purposes. And so, of course, they're going to be used for different reasons, but even the same tool would be used for different purposes, either by the same individual or across units and departments. And so there's a lot of variability there. The second big takeaway was this strong need for training. So in order to effectively use these tools, folks had to be trained, and there's cost issues there, there's travel issues, there's time away. If you're the only person in the department that's focusing on threat and risk assessment, spending a couple of days away to get training is difficult. And so the issue of training access came up quite a bit. And then the third one was really this bubbling recommendation around more universal standards with regard to risk and threat assessment. I just saw a great report came out this morning from the NTAC team offering some universal guidelines in this space. So those kinds of efforts were really asked for by this group. And I think there's room to provide some of those guidelines with regard to tool usage and interpretation to provide this common infrastructure and way to talk about these things. Another key finding as I start to sort of shift our discussion here was that there was one method that seemed to rise above the others in terms of utility. And that was the structured professional judgment test, or tool, I should say, method, SPJ. And I want to unpack that a little bit because it's a good segue to the discussion around novel threats. So SPJ in many ways became the gold standard with regard to threat and risk assessment tools and measurement and thinking about making decisions in this area and space. But I want to unpack sort of the two pieces of SPJ. So one is structured. So these tools are written with items or prompts that help guide a user through a series of things they should be thinking about or considering when making a decision. And then the second is professional judgment, which allows for some nuance and complexity based on that person's experience and expertise so that they can go in and leverage that past experience to make better informed decisions. This is useful and indeed necessary across the majority, if not the vast majority of use cases when it comes to making decisions around threat and risk assessment. However, they are predicated on an assumption of a threat I want to pull on a little bit, which is these tools require a previous event or action or demographic or set of profiles that existed prior that then informed the current, which gives some idea about a future threat. In other words, something must have happened in the past that's similar that says, all right, this individual or this context may be a threat or may not be a threat based on this previous experience. What's critical from a novel threat perspective is at times there isn't that baseline previous experience. And so while these tools are useful in the vast majority of cases, we wanted to better understand whether they were useful across all contexts, particularly with regard to novel and emerging threats. And so I want to just take a step back, and this is where I'll sort of narrow the aperture. And I guess just sort of mention the elephant in the room in some ways, which is if anyone on the call had 2,000 exploding pagers simultaneously on their terrorism-related bingo card, I would both like to hear who your bingo card supplier is, because I have a lot of questions around supply chain management these days. But it's an incredible illustration that's sort of in all of our minds right now, just about the surprise that can happen with regard to malevolent creativity and malevolent innovation when leveraged with a very intentional purpose. And so I mentioned that in some ways simply to illustrate it's very difficult to anticipate doing different things. There's a body of work that I've engaged in for the last 10 years or so that's showed this both empirically, and we've talked about it conceptually and theoretically as well. And the takeaway is simple. When we're trying to make decisions about new things, we're more likely to make errors about those decisions. This is true of benevolent and malevolent outcomes. And so we outline that in the report. I welcome you to take a look at that. But I'll just tell you a few reasons why we tend to make those mistakes. And the first one is when we're judging new things, we often lack evaluative standards, as I alluded to earlier. It's just a really simple example, and I know it's sort of dumbed down in some ways, but if I were to take someone that knew nothing about firearms and I were to show them a 22 caliber bullet and I'd show them a 50 caliber bullet and give them an idea about the range of lethality and the potential threat across those, I could then take another bullet that falls within that range, and they would have some guideline about what type of threat or how lethal that firearm that uses that caliber bullet might be. But when something's genuinely new or novel, we don't have that evaluative comparison. And as such, we tend to make mistakes and can commit errors for that reason. Another one that we make mistakes with regard to assessing new things is from a psychological perspective, it's hard to talk about new things. We've all been in the room where we had an idea that was a little out there, we were a little concerned about something, and we're afraid to bring it up because we feel like, oh, maybe that's too strange or that's too weird. Talking about new things is difficult. And then the third one is that we often don't have the language to have that discussion. I've got a couple of grad students here in the office that love soccer. I like to talk to folks about the things that they are passionate about, but I don't know anything about soccer. So I walk up and call the pitch field, and they get embarrassed and won't talk to me about things. I don't have the language with which to talk to them about those things. And so when we're addressing novel threats, neither side has the language to talk about these things because they don't exist yet. And so trying to come up with whether or not something is dangerous or could be potentially violent is difficult when it's that far out there. So taking two steps back, we often make mistakes about judgments with regard to new things. We know that through analogous literature, but we had not quite tested whether we make errors with regard to threats. And so if you've read the report, great. But if you've logged on today for anything new, I'm actually going to give you some information that's not in the report because we're still finishing up this finding. So it's a bit of a bonus findings incentive to get on and listen to us today. So really quickly, we did a study where we broke folks into 4 different conditions: a low novelty threat, medium, high, and extreme novelty threat. And we asked them a very simple question. Would you elevate this threat to your supervisor? Would you bring this up to somebody else, or would you dismiss it? And what we found was folks were far more likely, and the effect size was large, were far more likely to dismiss that threat or not elevate it the more novel the threat was. In other words, we were more likely to see folks make mistakes about escalating or elevating a threat when it was more novel, and the effect was clear and it was large. We also wanted to unpack that a little bit and ask why. One of the things that we found was fear, and it might not be in the way that you think. In fact, when folks were, they were more afraid of those low novelty threats because they understood those better. I call this the "can I pet that dog" phenomenon. So if you've been on the internet in the last 10 years, you've seen the little girl that stands on the porch and sees the bear walk out of the woods and screams, "Can I pet that dog? Can I pet that dog?" And the reason she does that is she's never seen a bear before. That's novel to her. And so she makes a mistake. She's not afraid of that novel thing. If it had been a snake, she'd have been afraid of it. She would have ran away. But instead, she ultimately was unconcerned and wanted to sort of embrace this dog. And so we, again, tend to make errors with regard to assessing new and different things. And we found that empirically, which I think is interesting. And this work is led by Sydney Reachin, and she's done a great job in this space. So to close out, and before I hand it off to Kat, what do we do? How do we manage and mitigate these things? I'll give you 3 ways, although there's several others, but I'll give you 3 ways quickly. The first is leadership. There's a lot of leaders on this call. Leaders set the tone for what's acceptable. Giving 5 minutes to explore further out their options, things that might be a little strange or different, and encouraging that. Second, leaders can't be in every meeting. So getting a chance to build a culture and a climate where you're not in the room, but folks are still asking these questions is critical. And then the third one is to red team, which I'm a huge advocate for, spending time thinking about how an adversary could engage in something negative or harmful or destructive, but doing so in such a way that pushes the boundaries with regard to creative thinking. That way, when you see evidence or indications of that, it's not the first time you've had that discussion and thought about it, and you think, oh, we actually game planned this a little bit in one of our meetings or our sessions. That widens the aperture and allows you to see things that you might miss otherwise. So those are 3 good tips, and there's others, but that's where I would start. Now, novel threats come in a variety of forms. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Gina first to allow Kat to talk a little bit about insider threats, which represents a form of novel threats as well.
Thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, my job is to transition between these wonderful panelists and get out of the way because I can't wait to hear what comes next. Dr. Kat Parsons is a full-time research faculty member here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where NCITE is headquartered. Kat got her Ph.D. At American University and studied with some of the great folks there in their interdisciplinary program related to national security, criminal justice, political science. She has a wonderful background looking at all of this. And what's so interesting about Kat, I think, is that she is also what we call an early career researcher. And so what this means is she has recently received her PhD, and that's a wonderful part of NCITE. We have 11 full-time faculty members that have this sort of background, and it means that she pushes the boundaries. She is thinking about things outside of the box. She is questioning things in the way that we've always done them. And we are just thrilled to have her with you today to talk about insider threats. So with that, Dr. Parsons, love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Gina. That was a lovely introduction. And I am just so grateful to be here, honestly, because when I was going through the PhD, it was so important to me to be able to do research that really got into the hands of the practitioners who need it. Which is just one of the amazing things about working with NCITE. You know, we really do work with our end users and try to make sure that we translate this research. And I again want to just reiterate the gratitude for the professionals who were so willing to take time out of their days to work with us and to really dig deep into these matters. So one of the areas that we honed in on was this issue of threat assessment and insider threats. And, you know, Dr. Matt Allen, also here at NCITE, helped lead these efforts as well. So I should definitely pay reference there. But, you know, one of the unique elements of this approach in our team was that we are, in fact, very interdisciplinary. I come from a more criminology background. And again, as Gina noted, a very interdisciplinary program. And also, everyone else on the team had their own unique backgrounds, such as in organizational psychology. And that combination of elements allowed for what I feel is a very unique perspective on this issue. But first, I must clarify what we're even talking about when we're looking at insider threats, because the gamut of what constitutes an insider threat essentially ranges from anyone who has inside contact or knowledge of an organization, such as employees or people who are just otherwise have some form of access. And it can include, you know, unintentional leaks of information or unintentional harm. So consider, for example, when people have accidentally left a door open, or if you accidentally let someone in the door with you when you're swiping your badge, right? We would consider that to be, you know, unintentional and insider threat, right? Because those are insiders of the organization, but there is no malicious intent. In this research vein, what we really focused on was those insiders who had that malicious intent. And that means those who were intending to cause harm to the organization through their actions, taking advantage of their insider status. So one thing that came up frequently when we started this research project was the disconnect oftentimes between the, you know, kind of analysis of insider threat, the detection and mitigation, and the behavioral threat assessment and management components within many organizations. And what I mean by that is that there are pillars. So we've actually called it silos, as you'll see in our report, where we have computer sciences over here, and we have threat assessment here, and we have organizational science here, and they're not necessarily speaking to each other. And this seems to be a very pervasive issue when looking at insider threats. In fact, a huge quantity of the research that we've looked at is coming out of computer sciences. And we do have many mitigation strategies that are, you know, born in the computer sciences world, right? Things that are automatically detecting for insider threats. But when there's an over-reliance on this sort of technology to help mitigate and monitor insiders, there's a couple of issues there. First, we're potentially taking a reactive standpoint. What that means is we're not getting to people before they have a chance to even have that malicious intent, right? We are having to wait for someone to do something in the act, essentially. And the other issue is that doesn't address some of the actual, you know, core triggers and factors that actually increase the risk of insider threat. Because while insiders are unique in many ways, when it comes to behavioral threat assessment guidelines, many of the risk factors and also the protective factors are very similar. But on the note of those silos, we also noticed that this, in addition to that disparity at times between a threat assessment team or the people responsible for threat assessment and those responsible for, you know, trying to evade insider threats, that separation. We also find that workplace violence doesn't always have a home, meaning that some people do conceptualize workplace violence as a form of, you know, an insider threat. Others do not. Generally, I think we take the stance that it is helpful to include workplace violence in that conceptualization. For one, because again, many of those risk factors are the same. And, you know, also it seems, and there's even been some reporting on this, that there are potentially increases in workplace violence incidents, worker on worker violence. And so this is potentially an increasingly relevant issue. And so when we're looking at these silos and talking about these silos and thinking about the issues, I should note that the efforts that are made in the computer science world and the strategies that exist, the mitigation efforts, things that are monitoring constantly for unauthorized access, for example, these are incredibly important. And they're important both for malicious insiders and for, you know, our unintentional or more negligent insiders. But they don't stand alone. And so we need to be very conscientious that we are also considering the human element here. And, you know, at least having communication between assessment teams and those, you know, in the computer science world, in the insider threat space. In general, just a more kind of holistic approach, because insiders can really present at any level in an organization. They can also be people who have left an organization but still have access to knowledge. And so, you know, even, for example, firing someone who has had some concerning behavior that may, you know, pose a potential insider threat down the road can still have consequences if that person, you know, has knowledge or access that they're able to use, or maybe other contacts within an organization, right? So these are all things to consider, and all part of why it is important to take a more, you know, integrative and holistic approach where there's a communication across an organization and across the various components that are responsible for managing these threat actors. So also that on that note, we've noticed that there is often just a lot of variability in how this is conceptualized. Generally, broadening our conception of insiders. So acknowledging the different levels of an organization and, you know, their access. This is ultimately going to improve our understanding of insider threats. And hopefully put us in a more preventive stance rather than a reactive one, which when we're looking at leaks of, you know, very, very sensitive information, this is a pretty important issue. So that takes me to the point of, are insiders different than other threat actors? And that is a sort of a yes and no answer. Again, when we look at the risk factors that have been identified in the literature and the protective elements, there's a lot of overlap with insiders. You know, those same tools, et cetera, are going to be helpful in mitigating insider threats. For instance, as Dr. Hunter noted, structured professional judgment tools that are catered towards mitigating insiders and so on. But there's some really noteworthy distinctions about insiders, right? When we're looking at insiders, there's two big elements that does distinguish them from a standard or, you know, generic threat actor. And that is that they are already situated within an organization. There's a lot more control. There's a lot more access to that individual. So as with a traditional threat assessment, someone who we don't have a contact with or any kind of rapport communication with, it can be more difficult to intervene, especially with those sort of protective factors that can prevent a threat from occurring. When we are dealing with insiders, we potentially have more room to, for instance, enact those protective elements that will prevent this from coming up in the first place, which again speaks to why keeping that human element in our analysis and our kind of detection efforts for insider threats is crucial. You know, and the other thing is that when we look at insiders and we look at past instances of people who have engaged in malicious activity, for example, we often see, and this is again similar to other threat actors, before something actually occurs, before there's actually violence or malicious activity, there's usually a triggering event of some sort. And when we look in insiders, that is often something relating to the workplace. So for example, we have seen in the past mass leakers who were subjected to bullying in the workplace. And, eventually that resentment helped lead to their actions of leaking highly sensitive information. And so I heard it said in one of our interviews that happy people don't kill coworkers. And it's a simple point, but says a lot, right? Like when we have happy employees who don't have grievances and who have these kinds of issues addressed, again, looking at that leadership level, the importance there, then we're just simply reducing the opportunity for, insiders to jump in, right? And so that leads me to my final note, which is the sort of shifting landscape that we've seen over time. Well, we've been, again, very, very on it when it looks at things like unauthorized access through computer systems. We also have to consider the changing nature of the actual threats that are occurring. So a lot of our framework, for example, around espionage and, sort of national security leaks, things of that nature, are coming out of statutes that are born out of the Cold War era, that are born out of a geopolitical climate that had large state actors pitted against each other. And we've seen something very different in, over the last 10 years or so, where we're having individuals who are not necessarily motivated by an outside actor, such as a state actor, or a particular ideology or belief system, so much as they're motivated by, potentially grandiosity, but also, these stated as altruistic goals, right? And so the nature of the threat has shifted over time as well. People are not necessarily, acting with nefarious state actors. I'm not saying that doesn't still happen, but we also have to be prepared and consider this sort of change in mass leakings, especially because they're not necessarily fitting the mold of people who are, financially, in financial despair, who are desperate for, getting paid off, for example, to commit these acts. There are people who are taking it upon themselves to do this. And so I think that we also need to be wary of that. And this brings me to the idea of like the pacing problem, which is the idea that our statutes or policies often lag behind changes in technology and shifts that occur around technology and society. And I think that, considering the that shift moving forward will help us again situate on a more preventive standpoint. On that note, I will hand it back off to Gina. But again, thank you. And our full report, which is very, very long, is also available through our website.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parsons. Really, I have a ton of questions, and I want to remind everyone who is watching, you may also have questions and you can ask them. And so if you'll use the Q&A function, we already have some that are rolling in. We want to make sure we have time for those. And so please ask your question of any of our panelists while the next one is presenting. So our final panelist needs a little introduction to this crowd, but I'm going to do it anyway. His name is Dr. Rik Legault, and Rik Legault, from an academic scholarly standpoint, has his Ph.D. in criminology from University of Albany. So lots of you on the call know exactly what that means in terms of his scientific training. But what it means for the Department of Homeland Security is that he is the senior social and behavioral scientist for the Undersecretary of Science and Technology. And so he translates a lot of the operational objectives, the IPT gaps for government speak, into research studies. And so he has the ear of Dmitry Kuzanov. He is very influential in terms of shaping science to policy, science to practice. He's giving us time today, even though he is in a beautiful location in the Netherlands. I have no idea what time it is there, but I'm really grateful that you are on and that you are able to share with us the importance of this kind of scientific approach to understanding threat assessment, and maybe just an overview of other projects you funded in this space. Would be really grateful to hear from you about what you've learned from your seat at Department of Homeland Security. So with that, Dr. Legault.
Thanks, Gina. It's such a pleasure to see good work and good science be able to be communicated clearly and start to build an evidence base that we can then help translate in the other direction and help our partners inside the Department of Homeland Security and throughout the U.S. government to improve what we do. The title of this talk is a great way to think about this problem because there are a number of different barriers from which we tend to suffer in any large bureaucracy, and the government is no different. But those potential problems of a lack of imagination, recognition, all of the potential informal social controls that might prevent someone from recognizing or even acting on a real novel threat, whether it be from inside or outside, are even more important to overcome when we think about the nature of the core job of the Department of Homeland Security, and that is to mitigate risks, which are often incredibly rare events and not well anticipated. So that means that our workforce at the Department of Homeland Security requires both a great deal of imagination and a great deal of courage, professionally, bureaucratically, and personally, to recognize and actually act on these types of threats that our department is mostly concerned with. But even though that's our core mission, I think I heard a couple of themes here which are reflected in some of our other work and reflective of the reason that I said that I'm really happy to see evidence and rigorous research be applied to these problems. George Clemenceau was the president of France after World War I, and he wasn't really interested in building the Maginot Line, and he's the guy that said that famous quote that generals were always fighting the last war or preparing to fight the last war, especially if they won it, right? So we want to avoid that pitfall and others as we're thinking about and determining our willingness and understanding how to improve our willingness to address those kind of threats. We can see this happening in how the Department of Homeland Security has addressed certain rare threats that we deal with over time. We're not perfect. We continue to improve, and research from NCITE and others has helped us do that as we've shifted a lot of our work away from trying to understand the varied and different motivations of people who will commit to or support illegal acts or violence in the name of an ideology, to thinking more about what are the cognitive and behavioral indications of the commission of an act of violence. And more importantly, rather than really studying the perpetrators and thinking about how to interrupt that, really spending a lot of time studying and improving administratively what's necessary and what do we do and what actions do we take in that prevention. And I think that this is a step in the right direction of doing the same for other types of rare threats like insider threat. It also, these fields are notoriously difficult to study and study effectively, in large part because in both cases, the vast majority of our data is derived from people who actually were successful at doing some heinous act, or in the case of a lot of insider threats, they're the people who were successful and got caught. And those are the ones we really know about. We don't necessarily know about all of them. And even those are really rare. So it makes it very difficult to describe those things. psychologically safe space where if somebody can manage your way out of actively predict risk as changes in of whether or not somebody will consider something else. And leaders training people who are supposed to, their full-time job is to help recognize insider threats, as well as people whose full-time job is not just the assessment, which assessment in itself can actually increase risk, but the management of people that may be experiencing some kind of difficulty before they commit a crime, and being able to really focus on that management piece as well. Lastly, I also really appreciate the nuance and understanding how important it is to perhaps differentiate when it comes to these threats and risks, what might be at stake in differences between the public and private sector as we think about these things. The primary motivation of the public sector usually leads us to commit resources to programs where we really manage individual risk, hopefully effectively throughout its life cycle, because our goal is to really mitigate, minimize that risk. Whereas in the private sector, we may observe things happening very differently because their primary goal in their definition of risk and how they think about it has less to do with public well-being and national security and more to do with the well-being of an individual company. And so while we learn a lot from each other, those fundamental differences between those two groups lead to very different looking programs, very different looking definitions of success, and programs and that end in very different states when we think we're done dealing with a risk. For instance, when the private sector feels like they're done dealing with a risk, a public sector risk management activity may feel like they've only just begun their work, and they have a lot more to do working with individuals in those cases. So again, I'm very happy to join this group and honored. I'm very excited about this report being finalized and being made available to everyone. And it is what time is it here? It's 5:45 in the Netherlands, and I know we need to leave a little time at the end for some questions and answers. And so again, very happy to add this work to the corpus of knowledge, and happy that we're addressing such really high level important issues with quality research through NCITE and this valuable report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Don't turn off your cameras yet, panelists, because we have questions rolling in the chat. And so I need to make sure that I am asking all of you. So order of operations, number one, if you're an audience member and you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. We are going to try to get to them, but we're also going to just share them with the panelists so they can answer you individually if you like. But the first one I'm going to ask is actually for you, Rik, and it's coming from one of our government partners at Customs and Border Protection. And they asked a really important follow-up question to something you pulled on, which is the importance of improving psychological safety to increase the chance that employees will come forward and discuss concerns. They asked about, steps that you think a leader could do to improve psychological safety, to reduce that kind of risk in the workplace that Dr. Parsons and Dr. Hunter talked about. But if there's also any research that you particularly have sponsored or anything that could speak to this as it relates to psychological safety and culture, that would also be helpful for you to speak to.
Oh, I'm not going to pull out any particular studies. In fact, Sam or Gina would probably be way better at that than I would. I know there is a vast literature in this area. You kind of caught me, whoever asked the question, because not only have I seen a lot of that in research, and not only have I had to lead really diverse teams on different areas of research at the Department of Homeland Security, I've spent 35 years in the active duty and reserves of the military and went from being a junior enlisted person to a field grade officer. And the one thing that kills agility and leadership is creating an environment where people are scared to bring bad news to the forefront of whatever's going on, or they're scared to ask questions about something they don't understand that they think might be a problem. So, I think that from my perspective at this point, that is and it's why I said you can't manage your way out of that. You can't create rules that are a checklist for leaders to use on how to not be a jerk and take your staff seriously. But you can promote people who have the ability to do that, and you can demand it of your leaders. I like as my career grew, I would tell people all the time in the Air Force part of my life, as I was setting expectations for leaders below me, that you will be the leaders that these airmen deserve. Right. And I have the same attitude at the Department of Homeland Security. And then from a research perspective, we just know that if you want an agile, responsive anything, you've got to have people feel like it's safe to bring up ideas. It doesn't mean you have to act on them all the time. They might not be great ideas. It might not be a real problem. But the one time that if you shut people down over and over again, they also won't bring you the real problem. So I think that's from an experiential viewpoint and in a kind of a broad strokes knowledge of the literature in that area. I'd say that's vitally important to any enterprise, but especially this type of problem.
Excellent. Thank you. And I actually will ask that follow on to Sam Hunter. I know that one of the deliverables from this project, Dr. Legault and Office of University Programs both ask us to publish our findings in peer-reviewed outlets. And so one of the seminal articles that's come out of this study has been published in Safety Science. And maybe, Sam, you might be able to talk about that psychological safety culture and what leaders could do to promote that. And we could also share that out. It's on our digital commons. But Sam, if you want to share any kind of high points from that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, Rik touched on, I think, the key takeaways, which is it often comes down to leadership. And I'll, I guess, push that even further and say the kinds of behaviors that are role modeled by leaders sets the tone for what's acceptable and what's appropriate. So a leader has to be vulnerable in a sense. And I think one of the most effective ways that I've seen is when a leader talks about the mistakes that they've made, you now make it okay to talk about some of the more challenging and difficult things from those around you. It is hard because it's embarrassing to talk about those things. You want to seem competent to your team. You don't want to be vulnerable. You want to be the strong leader. But if you want to get ideas out of folks and hear the things that they're holding back because they're afraid of looking silly or stupid or dumb, you have to model that for people. That's the best advice, but also the hardest advice. And so that's evident in some of the work that we talked about. I've seen it anecdotally and empirically as well. So I know we've got other questions, but I would emphasize, yeah, you got to do it, and it's hard.
That's great. I'm going to follow up with you with a question we have from Ryan. He's asking about a thorny topic, but I know you've given some thought to it, Sam. So I'd like to hear yours publicly. But you're advocating for structured professional judgment assessments in this space. A lot of the literature and research you're finding is supporting some of that. And especially as it relates to BTAM, so behavioral threat assessment and management. And so as you see people from CP3 right now advocating that BTAM is a prevention-based model, and just wondering how you are reconciling sort of the structured professional judgment and this sort of early stage prevention, public health approach to preventing violence. And, you know, can these structured professional judgment tests play a role in prevention?
Yeah, when we talk to the folks that are using them, again, we talked about the variability of use cases. At times they had to be used either post boomer bang or even closer to boomer bang in terms of trying to make a case for whether somebody should be investigated further. But the most optimistic scenario is further left of boom and bang. So if anybody gets an indication, again, this comes back to building a culture and a climate where somebody notices that somebody at work is a little off or they're going through a thing, and you have that early conversation, the degree that you can identify some of those early warning indicators, and it may not be a formal assessment that's done using these tools, but the folks that use them have a keen understanding of what the underlying elements are. Now we start to have a conversation really before any mobilization starts to occur, whether that's at a team level formally, or whether that's just sort of more informally because you built the right culture and climate within the organization. The further left we're having those conversations, the better we are, both in terms of tool usage as well as just preventing things from happening. So absolutely, they're part of it. And it's that professional judgment piece in particular. These are forms of expertise that have been earned over time. And if you can identify those early warning indicators through the experiences that you've had, grounded in this good science and tools, you're more likely to prevent these things and catch them early. So yeah, hand in hand, and lots of indications that that's useful.
I'm gonna use my prerogative here, Sam. Can you expand on that a little bit and talk about the difference between using any variety of these tools for a snapshot in time versus using them to understand changes in behavior over time and the relative value?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, they have different design purposes, you know, sort of depending upon who creates them, but because of the demands and needs that folks are using them for, at times they're simply using them to solve the problem that's in front of them. And so you got sort of the empirical design element, but then you've also got the sort of practical use case, boots on the ground kind of approach. And so there is a lot of variability there in terms of application.
Great. So we have a whole body of research on behavioral threat assessment and management and integration. I would encourage you, maybe that should be our next NCITE Presents, to talk about some of that work as well, and work that science and technology has funded for us to strengthen those efforts, because we could talk all day about that question you just asked, Rik. But in the interest of time, I do want to make sure we give each of our panelists sort of final thoughts and final words. We have more questions than we have time to answer in the chat, so we will make sure to get those to the panelists, and I encourage you to follow up with NCITE to get a hold of them as well. But I'd first like to go in order of operation and have Dr. Kat Parsons speak first, then we'll have Sam Hunter, and then we'll have Rik Legault close us out. So Kat, you know, I love all of your work on insider threat. I think insider threat, just as an org psychologist, is inherently novel because you don't expect people that you work with, your colleagues, to want to hurt your organization or hurt people around it. And so I'm just really eager to hear sort of your final thoughts and what you might want to leave the viewers with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think this is an important area that, you know, is potentially of increasing concern simply because of our, you know, reliance on these interconnected computer systems. And again, highlighted by just the complications of supply chain and identifying the, you know, very convoluted points at which someone could potentially become an insider and intervene. And so it is especially crucial there. But I think the thing I just want to leave people with is that there is a very strong human element here. Insiders are people, right? They're humans. They are, you know, engaging in human behavior. And we need to remember that when we're designing systems. We need, you know, to have behavioral sciences has a lot to learn from the computer sciences on this issue and vice versa. And, you know, I would just advocate for bridging those gaps increasingly, you know, working together to really expand our approach and really hone in on that interdisciplinary kind of left of Boone prevention strategy so that we don't lose sight of that human issue.
Go ahead, Sam.
I guess the thing that I'll close out with is maybe a little less optimistic than I should, but I'm incredibly impressed by the folks that we get a chance to work with in Homeland Security Enterprise. They are creative and they are quite adept at stopping things. They prevent things every day that the public doesn't hear about, and they're heroes. And I am absolutely blown away by how impressed I am. That ultimately means, however, that the adversary gets more creative. They're not stopping. The bad guys aren't going away, nor are they stopping in the need to ultimately attack our way of life and our allies' way of life. And if we're doing a good job at stopping things, they have to come up with new ways to attack us. And so this idea of novel threats, malevolent creativity is in some ways begotten by the job that we've done quite well in a number of circumstances. And so we have to outcreate them. And I think we have the ability to do that. But we have to leverage some of the things that we talked about here today in order to do that. That's our superpower that I think they don't have and we do.
What, Rik?
The George Clemenceau quote in Sam's statement, I think, is true. We're seeing a shift from small, flexible organizations with very little resources who may not have really understood the United States very well, inspiring attacks against the United States and often from developing nations to, constant changes and more modern threats. If anybody's paying attention, the FSB has been recruiting people using a lot of the techniques that were used to recruit violent extremists to commit pretty serious acts of sabotage throughout Europe for the last few months, right? And so if you have a well-funded, state-backed, organized intelligence service trying to do that, how much worse will that be for us? How much will it change what we do? Will we be able to recognize it? And will the same types of prevention work? And I think, if you had asked any of us 10 years ago, are we worried about Russian intelligence service instigating attacks within the United States? I think we would have said that was crazy. And even 6 months ago, we might have said that would be pretty nuts for them to do. They're now doing it in Europe. So, and trying to inspire the assassination of major, corporate figures and these types of things. So as we are thinking about how we deal with the now, the really common themes and principles that science can reveal for us, such as the things that we've heard today, that can be applied across a broad spectrum of threats to just make us better at what we do, I think is a really important contribution of science to this area. And because of that, we need to be able to value and implement these things, even if they sound pretty broad. They're designed to be, because they allow us to then address very specific things more effectively. And I would like to thank the panelists, my fellow panelists here, for bringing more high quality research to that issue. Thank you.
Thanks everyone so much. So we are still getting questions coming into the Q&A. So I am committing to getting these questions to our panelists, because there are some awesome ones in here. I'm looking at you, Patricia, who just wrote one. She submitted a really great one that I'm curious to hear everyone's responses. But in the meantime, I do want to give you a way to access some of these reports that have been funded by Science and Technology from Department of Homeland Security, so that it's for the public good. So we want you to be able to use them. And this is our website. We have links to all of them. Please follow us on social. Email us if you'd like to reach out to any of these panelists. But really grateful for the platform that Office of University Programs has given us to be the Center of Excellence for Department of Homeland Security, and for the funding that Science and Technology has given us to be able to conduct this incredibly meaningful and important work. So Thanks everyone for your time, and we will look forward to the next NCITE